Summer 1922. Jazz in the air. Secrets in every glass of champagne. Beneath the glamour, something was unraveling. That illusion shattered when two lovers were found dead in a Packard by the lake hands intertwined. Lives ended by gunfire. Welcome to Criminal Mindcast, where true crime meets the untold. We don't just examine what happened, we uncover why, through psychology, silence, and the shadows people leave behind. We explore the fragile line between love and ruin, passion and violence. Today, we bring you a story of elegance and rot, a tale born in the Gatsby era, where betrayal wore diamonds, and love sometimes ended in blood. This is the case of Evelyn Hartley and Theodore "Teddy" Marrow, a double slaying that remains unsolved, a cold case buried beneath the music, money, and murmurs of a small town with a dark past. Evelyn Hartley arrived in New Haven in the spring of 1920 with a worn leather suitcase and a voice that could melt the smoke off a bourbon glass. Just 23, she carried no past she was willing to share and no name anyone could trace. Her first night singing at the Velvet Room, a smoky jazz lounge for bootleggers and broken men, she captivated the room. She wasn't beautiful in the obvious way. Her allure was quieter, like a sharp intake of breath, the kind that made people forget what they were saying. She became a fixture on stage, satin-draped and bathed in shadow, but behind every smooth sit note, attentive listeners heard a tremor, fragile, almost afraid. Something haunted her voice, as though each lyric was a secret she couldn't quite confess. The chandeliers sparkled, the drinks flowed, but Evelyn always sang like the room was darker than it looked. Evelyn wasn't her real name. She'd changed it at least 3 times before the age of 25. Born in rural Mississippi, she left behind a trail of rumors that followed her like cigarette smoke. Some said she'd once been engaged, but the man vanished without explanation. Others claimed she'd grown up in a house with an uncle who wasn't just cruel, but dangerous. Her mother died when Evelyn was still a girl. The official cause was illness, but locals spoke of strange bruises and police visits that never amounted to anything. No family ever came to see her perform. Her past was a void, and she worked hard to keep it that way. Her friends, if they could be called that, said she woke up screaming sometimes. Said she drank alone in her dressing room after every show, eyes fixed on something no one else could see. She lived in a small apartment above a tailor shop, alone, but she rarely slept that way for long. Her lovers came and went like storm clouds, intense, brief, and often followed by silence. Theodore Marrow, known to the town simply as Teddy, came from a world Evelyn could never truly enter, even when she stood beside him. He was the only son of the Marrow Steel dynasty, a family that practically built New Haven with smoke and steel. Teddy was handsome in that old money way, tailored suits, slicked hair, and a gaze that seemed to weigh the worth of every person he met. His charm was undeniable, but it felt like a performance, precise, practiced, predatory. Teddy had been raised in the Grand Marrow estate on the hill, behind iron gates and manors carved from cold expectation. His mother, Josephine, was a social queen with a will like iron. His father, Charles Sr., was colder still, a man who considered emotion a form of weakness and discipline the only virtue worth passing down. In a house of high ceilings and higher standards, Teddy grew up learning to hide every real feeling. He studied philosophy at Yale, a gesture to tradition more than interest. But even in academia, he found no peace. Rumor had it he was forced to leave after an incident with a fellow student, something about a heated argument during a debate on Nietzsche that ended with a fall down the stairs. No charges were filed. The student transferred. Teddy came home, quieter than before. He met Evelyn during one of her sets at the Velvet Room. He didn't fall in love. He became obsessed. He sent champagne to her table every night for a month before speaking a single word to her. He filled her dressing room with flowers she never asked for, jewelry she never wore. He watched her sing with the intensity of a man studying scripture. He never clapped. When she asked why, he said, "Applause is for things that end. You don't applaud eternity." She called him my quiet audience. He called her my salvation. The first time, she laughed. The last time, she didn't dot to outsiders. Their relationship looked like a fantasy, the steel air and the songstress, a story worthy of jazzage gossip columns. But New Haven is a small town wearing a large disguise, and when the whispers began, they weren't about romance. They were about volatility. The cracks appeared quickly. Shouting matches outside garden, parleys, shattered glasses in elegant hotel lobbies. Evelyn once arrived at a show with a bruise she blamed on a fall. A week later, Teddy's hand was in a cast. Still, no matter how ugly it got, they always came back to each other, drawn together by something magnetic, volatile, and deeply unresolved. Some said Evelyn saw Teddy as a lifeliner, escape from poverty, a shield of privilege. But others, those who truly knew her, suspected the opposite, that she feared what he represented, that his world was a gilded cage. Yet she stayed, because sometimes the line between love and survival is impossibly thin. Teddy's possessiveness deepened. He demanded to know her whereabouts, questioned every smile, every glance. He once insisted the Velvet Room fire a pianist for looking at her too long. His mother was no quieter in her disdain, calling Evelyn common, unfit, and threatening to cut Teddy off entirely. But instead of retreating, Teddy became more intense, more determined, more dangerous. Then came the whispers, that Charles Meroted's younger, softer-spoken brother had once pursued Evelyn too, that she turned him down gently, that something broke between the brothers after that. Charles, a recluse and aspiring poet, was everything Teddy wasn't. But in families like the Marrows, resentment doesn't explode at fisters. Quietly, by the summer of 1922, everything was fraying. Evelyn seemed tired. Her performances felt heavier, her voice more distant. Teddy had begun speaking of marriage. Evelyn, of leaving town. Whether she meant it, no one could say. But someone, maybe Charles, maybe no one heard her say she felt, watched, that she was scared. On August 17th they left a party near the lake. They never made it home. By morning their story ended not in a promise, but in blood. Their hands were still clasped when police found them holding on for finally letting go. On the night of August 17th, 1922, Evelyn Hartley took the stage at the Velvet Room for what would be her final performance. The lounge buzzed with its usual haze of smoke, jazz, and broken glamour men in crisp suits, women masking pain with powder and charm. But something in the air felt different. Witnesses would later describe Evelyn's set as haunting, slowed by sorrow. One patron said she sang like she had already said goodbye. Her rendition of Autumn Leaves felt less like a song, more like a requiem. Teddy Morrow was there, but not in his usual seat. He sat alone, distant, staring at Evelyn with an expression somewhere between longing and loss. Bartenders recalled he barely touched his drink and left no tipod for someone who once handed out 20s like candy. When Evelyn finished her final number, she didn't acknowledge the applause. She walked off stage, past Teddy without a word. A moment later, they exited together into the thick, humid night. Outside, the cicadas sang in the trees. The lake, not far away, glistened under the moon like shattered glass. By morning, both Evelyn and Teddy had vanished. 12 hours later, just after noon, their bodies were discovered in the back seat of Teddy's 1919 Packard automobile. The vehicle had been tucked behind a dense willow grove along the northern shore of Lake Whitney, hidden from the road and the eyes of early risers. They were found seated side by side, as if resting after a long night. Their heads leaned toward each other. Their hands were still clasped. Each had a bullet wound to the head. There was no sign of a struggle. No glass was broken. The windows were rolled up. The doors were locked. The car keys were found in the ignition, untouched. There were no fresh tire marks leading to the scene. No footprints in the mud, just the body's silence, and the scent of lilac and gunpowder clinging to the summer air that at first. The police leaned toward a tragic conclusion, murder-suicide born of passion, jealousy, or despair. It fit the narrative, Evelyn's troubled past, Teddy's reputation for volatility, their combustible romance. But then the details began to erode that tidy theory. Evelyn's handbag, found on the floor of the passenger seat, had been unzipped. Her wallet was missing. Yet her sapphire necklace, a piece valued at several $1,000s, remained untouched on her collarbone. Nothing else had been taken. Teddy's gold pocket watch had stopped precisely at 1:47 a.m., its crystal face cracked. There was no sign of forced entry into the car. Then came the witness. A man walking his dog near the lake around 2 a.m. claimed he saw a figure near the grove toll, still, seemingly suspended in the mist. He couldn't describe the face, or even the clothing. But he insisted on one eerie detail. The figure didn't walk, it floated. Police wrote off the statement as the product of fatigue or imagination. More strangeness followed. A neighbor living in a house overlooking the lake contacted investigators 2 days later. She reported seeing a man loitering, near the edge of her fence on the evening of August 15th, 2 nights before the murders. He was tall, thin, wearing a dark hat. He didn't speak. He didn't move, just stood there. She'd told a passing officer, but nothing came of it. Weeks later, she found a cigarette butt half buried in her flower bed. It wasn't hers. She handed it to the authorities. No one followed up. The autopsies revealed both victims were shot with the same small-caliber pistol. Neither had gunshot residue on their hands. That alone challenged the murder-suicide theory. Forensics were still in their infancy, but some things didn't require modern science to raise suspicion. Then came the turning point. As police catalogued Evelyn's belongings, they found something strange. Hidden inside the powder well of her silver makeup compact was a folded slip of parchment faintly perfumed, torn at the edges. It was a letter, a love letter, but not from Teddy. The handwriting on the letter, later verified by a Marrow family member, belonged to Charles Marrow, Teddy's younger brother. Quiet, introspective, and known for his literary aspirations. Charles had always existed in the background of the powerful Marrow dynasty. The letter itself was brief, but explosive. In implication, meet me by the water. Midnight, we'll leave it all behind. If they find out, everything burns. With those words, the case shifted dramatically. What once seemed a tragic lovers' pact now hinted at betrayal, a forbidden affair, and perhaps an intentional cover-up. The media seized the angle, flooding headlines with tales of scandal, deceit, and a crumbling dynasty. The already maligned Marrow family faced intense public scrutiny. Yet instead of resolution, the investigation unraveled further. The Packard, inexplicably cleaned at a local garage before forensic testing, was stripped of potential evidence. Evelyn's makeup compact vanished from the police archive. Charles, when briefly questioned, denied writing the letter, then abruptly departed for Europe, claiming a need for inspiration. Till was never charged. Digging into the family's history, reporters uncovered years of tension between the brothers' rivalry for their father's favor, corporate control, and possibly Evelyn's affection. Whether Charles's involvement was genuine or calculated, the truth remained elusive, tangled in wealth, secrecy, and ambition. Whatever the truth, the official investigation stalled. No weapon was ever found. No fingerprints tied to anyone beyond Evelyn and Teddy. The crime scene remained one of the cleanest in local history, almost too clean. Some began to whisper that the Morrows had buried the truth, just like they'd buried problems before with money, connections, and silence. Others blamed Evelyn herself, painting her as a seductress who pushed two brothers to madness. The press, once romanticizing her, turned cruel. Jazz siren sparks double death, one headline read. Years passed, the case went cold. But even decades. Later, those who remembered Evelyn said she had been trying to leave, that she feared something or someone, and that maybe, just maybe, the Packard wasn't where the story ended, only where it was silenced. Nothing about that night ever truly made sense. And in a place like New Haven, where silence is often stronger than justice, perhaps it was never meant to. The initial police report read like a script written in haste. 2 bodies, 1 gun, no signs of forced entry, case closed. It was a narrative that fit neatly into New Haven's craving for order one final line. Drawn beneath a story too messy to tell aloud, the authorities offered a simple tale. A jealous lover's quarrel turned deadly. An emotional crescendo befitting the jazz-soaked drama of Evelyn and Teddy. But even before the ink dried on the reports, the community began to feel the edges fray. Whispers of unease started at the Velvet Room. Regular patrons noticed how quickly the police had come and gone, how little they seemed to care about what had truly happened that night. Staff at that lounge said no officers had come to question them. Evelyn's fellow performers, her friends, said they were never contacted. The apartment above the tailor's shop, Evelyn's home, was never searched. The tailor said no one even knocked. Critics questioned the speed of the investigation. Forensic protocol was either ignored or never followed. No fingerprints were taken from the Packard. No tests for gunpowder residue were performed on either the victim. The bullet trajectory analysis was vague, relying on assumptions rather than hard evidence. Photographs of the scene were minimal. The autopsy reports were delayed, then redacted. It felt as if the police had written the ending before ever understanding the plot. Then the press arrived. What had been a local tragedy blossomed into a national spectacle. Reporters flooded into New Haven from Boston, New York, even Chicago. The New Haven Herald ran its first headline in thick black print. Death of a jazz siren. Underneath it, a black and white photograph of Evelyn's closed mid-song. A single earring catching the spotlight dominated the page. But instead of mourning her, the media painted her as a femme fatale. The papers called her the flapper, give fatal love, the Mississippi mystery, the girl who sang too sweet. They dissected her wardrobe, her lyrics, her lovers. They questioned her past, her motives, her morality. Within days, Evelyn Hartley was no longer a woman. She was a story, a warning, a symbol of temptation and tragedy. Jazz singers across the East Coast reported sudden cancellations. Church sermons referenced Evelyn as a lesson in modesty and moral discipline. Teddy's coverage, in contrast, was forgiving, reverent, even. The papers painted him as a victim of heartbreak, a tortured heir undone by passion. His past, his breakdowns, violent outbursts. The incident at Yale was conveniently omitted. No one interviewed his ex-girlfriends. No one quoted the nurse, who once claimed he screamed in his sleep about fire and drowning. He was rich. He was white. He was a Marrow. The public wanted a hero, and the press delivered with national attention came speculation. Theories proliferated like cigarette smoke in a speakeasy. Some said it was a robbery gone wrong. Others whispered about mob involvement, citing Charles Marot Sr.'s alleged dealings with bootleggers and union enforcers. A few leaned heavily into the Charles Marot, Twenties' younger brother and, perhaps, Evelyn's secret lover. That letter, found in Evelyn's compact written, in Charles's unmistakable hand, spoke of fear, escape, and love unspoken. If they find out, everything burns. Yet for all the drama, nothing stuck. There was no conclusive evidence, no confession, just shadows and hearsay. Rumors, not facts, drove the story forward. And as the weeks passed, the official narrative began to shift. The police issued 3 conflicting statements over the span of a single month. First, they called it a murder-suicide, with Teddy as the perpetrator. Then, a double homicide by an unknown assailant. Finally, they settled on the most convenient option, an ongoing investigation. Each announcement chipped away at the community's trust. It wasn't just that the answers were unclear, it was that the people in charge didn't seem to want them clarified. The evidence grew thinner with time. The Packard had been washed before a full examination. Evelyn's compact containing Charles's letter was mysteriously misplaced from the evidence locker. Cigarette butt found near the crime scene, first dismissed by police, was later reported missing altogether. Meanwhile, Charles Marot quietly left town. As the case unraveled, so did the town's composure. The Velvet Room saw dwindling crowds. Patrons said it felt cursed. Musicians moved on. Mothers warned their daughters to stay away from the stage, from lovers who came bearing roses and lies. The lake, once a favorite retreat, became a site of local dread. People claimed to see shadows near the Willow Grove. Some said they heard music-faint jazz notes drifting across the water, followed by a woman's whisper, then silence. The story took on a mythic quality. Over the years, it transformed from a tabloid scandal to a ghost story. Children dared each other to walk the shoreline at night. Teenagers lit candles where the car had once been parked. But still, no answers came. Time passed, but the case never disappeared. Every few years, a young reporter would try to reopen the file. A documentary crew from Boston would appear and ask questions, then vanish after a cease and desist from the Marot family lawyers. A podcast dedicated a 3-part series to the Gatsby-era double slaying, reigniting online interest, but turning up nothing new. A retired detective once showed a faded photograph of the crime scene to a class of cadets and said, "This is what happens when power decides what justice looks like." The question always remained, why had justice been so incomplete? Why had so little been done? The answers, it seemed, were buried beneath money and reputation. Perhaps the truth was never meant to be found in evidence. Perhaps it was sealed behind closed doors and stitched into silence by privilege. It lived in the gaps between police statements, in the fingerprints never lifted, in the cigarette butt never tested, in the handwritten letter that vanished without trace. Justice doesn't always sleep, but sometimes it's told to look the other way. And in New Haven, in the summer of 1922, it did. To truly understand the case of Evelyn Hartley and Theodore Marot, one must step beyond crime scene tape and evidence logs. The truth, if it exists, doesn't reside solely in bullet casings or witness statements. It lies within the human psyche, in traumas carried from childhood, in wounds wrapped in silence, in the desperate desire to preserve illusions at any cost. This was never just a crime of passion. It was a slow-motion collision between love and survival, between appearance and authenticity, between privilege and powerlessness. The psychological undertones paint a grim portrait. If Charles Marot was involved, it might not have been out of hatred, but something more insidious. Fear of discovery, fear of disgrace, fear of losing the only thing that felt real in a life of shadows and expectations. Charles lived in the margins of his family's legacy, overshadowed by Teddy, dismissed by his father, pitied by the community. He was the artist in a family of tycoons, a man who traded steel for verse and ballroom galas for hidden notebooks. His rumored relationship with Evelyn, if it ever truly existed, would have been a scandal of Shakespearean proportions. For someone like Charles, Evelyn may have been a lifeline, a rebellion, or a muse. If he believed she was slipping away or being taken from him, that could have sparked something dark, not out of cruelty, but desperation. Psychologically, the theory is consistent with what clinicians call attachment trauma, when someone's sense of self becomes entangled with their partner, real or imagined. Any separation, especially perceived betrayal, feels like existential collapse. It's not heartbreak, it's annihilation. Evelyn, meanwhile, was not simply a tragic beauty. She was a survivor. Her life was defined by abandonment, by the death of her mother, by whispered abuse, by a history she worked hard to erase. Teddy wasn't just a lover, he was a fortress. Wealth, power, access to a future she might never have reached alone. But that fortress had bars. His love came with control, obsession, surveillance. Her friends said she felt watched, smothered, caged. The man who sent flowers also monitored her movements, who she spoke to, what she wore, her songs, her silences. What happens when a woman who has lived her whole life trying to escape becomes trapped again, just with better furniture? Perhaps Evelyn saw in Charles a way out, or perhaps she simply wanted out, and Charles misread her pain for passion. Either way, the dynamic formed a triangle not of romance, but instability. In family systems theory, such triangulations often implode, especially when secrecy, mental illness, and power imbalance are at play, and Teddy's unraveling was slow, but visible in hindsight. Journal entries discovered decades later in the Morrow estate reveal a mind spiraling into paranoia. He wrote of hearing Evelyn's voice in rooms she hadn't entered, of dreams filled with drowning and fire. He believed, truly, that Evelyn belonged to him, that she was salvation wrapped in satin. And salvation, to men like him, was never allowed to walk away. In psychology, this is a textbook case of narcissistic collapse. When someone who defines their identity through control and adoration senses that both are slipping away, the mind fractures. Rage replaces charm, obsession replaces affection, and in some extreme cases, the desire to possess becomes fatal. It's not unthinkable. Then, that the killer, whoever they were, believed they were preserving something: love, legacy, control. In psychological terms, this phenomenon is known as fatal preservation. The belief that the only way to stop loss is through destruction. It's commonly found in personality disorders where emotional regulation is impaired, and where abandonment feels like psychic death. In those moments, time must stop. The only peace is silence. Consider Evelyn's final journal entry. Discovered in a cracked leather notebook beneath her vanity mirror, he says, "Love means never leaving, but I already have." 8 words. A farewell. A line that feels less like a goodbye and more like a death sentence. Was she planning to leave Teddy that night? Was Charles involved in the decision? Did someone else learn of it? The inconsistencies in the case never disappeared. Evelyn's missing wallet, the cologne scent that belonged to no one in the car, the destroyed camera, the cigarette butt in the flower bed, the letter from Charles folded neatly beneath Evelyn's compact mirror, referencing a secret and a threat. If they find out, everything burns. One theory holds that a third figure was present that night. someone never named set in police records, a fixer, a loyalist, a shadow behind the curtains of wealth, perhaps not driven by love or revenge, but by duty. In families like the Maros, legacy is currency, and scandal is debt. The theory goes that this third person ensured silenced force through manipulation, through disappearance. Maybe they still live in New Haven. Maybe they still visit the Grove each year, placing lilies beneath the willows where the Packard once sat. The aftermath tells its own story. The Velvet Room shuttered within a year. Its owner never reopened another club. The Merrow estate went dark, its windows boarded, its parties ceased. Charles vanished into Europe. He was seen briefly in Prague, then never again. Some say he joined a monastery. Others say he drank himself into oblivion. Teddy's parents died within 2 years of the tragedy, their fortune donated to a charitable trust. Not a cent went toward reopening the investigation. Today, the lake is mostly quiet. Children are warned to stay away after dark. Locals claim to hear jazz floating from the Grove during the August heat. Some say Evelyn sings to the trees. Some say Teddy answers. The crime remains unsolved. The official file labels it a double death by unknown circumstances. But anyone who's followed the case knows the truth is more complicated than that. It was never just about who pulled the trigger. It was about the storm that brewed long before. In the end, what haunts us isn't just the act. It's the recognition that, somewhere, beneath the horror, is something we recognize in ourselves. The desperation to be loved, the terror of being left, the lies we tell to keep our illusions alive. And so the final question isn't who really pulled the trigger. If fear is a mirror, what does it show us about ourselves? The story of Evelyn Hartley and Theodore Marrow isn't just about a double slaying in the glamorous haze of the 1920s. It's about the ways we love, the secrets we keep, and the shadows we carry. It's about how silence sometimes screams louder than any confession. A case that remains open not just in police files, but in the psyche of a town that refuses to remember, and a generation that never truly asked why. In this story, guilt has no fingerprints, love has no innocence, and justice has no voice. If this story stayed with you, if it made you question, linger, or look at love a little differently, consider giving it a like, sharing the video, and subscribing to Criminal Mindcast, where we uncover quiet, unsettling truths that still whisper through history. Some crimes leave no screams, only questions, and some silences echo louder than any confession. Thank you for listening to Criminal Mindcast.
References 1. Capote, T. 1966. In Cold Blood. Random House. Point 2. Rule, A. 1980. The Stranger Beside Me. W. W. Norton. Point 3. Douglas, J., and Allshaker, M. 1995. Mindhunter, Inside the FBI's Elite Serial Crime Unit. Scribner.